Where the hell do I even begin with this one? Released in 2017, this was a long-awaited entry in the Xenoblade Chronicles series, let alone the entire Xeno franchise. For the few of you who don't know, this game didn't happen right after Xenoblade Chronicles, but rather after Xenoblade Chronicles X, a title that went in a bit of a different direction. Xenoblade Chronicles was an open-world JRPG, but heavily story-driven, whereas X put more of an emphasis on the open-world aspect, creating a very different feeling game. One that left people feeling some type of way upon release, meaning it was high time to start working on a more story-focused entry in the series, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, labeling itself as the proper continuation from the original. You could reasonably play X without needing any knowledge from the original, and the same could be said about 2 to some extent, but this game was clearly made with the intention of having played the original first, especially when taking the endgame reveals into consideration, and that alone got a lot of people excited. Remember, this was at a time where everyone sang Xenoblade Chronicles praises. Not to mention, it was one of the first major JRPGs for Switch players to sink their teeth into at the tail end of an already phenomenal year, not just for gaming, but the system's launch. Imagine being hit by Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, then a sequel to Xenoblade Chronicles without taking into consideration all the good stuff happening on other consoles. 2017 was freaking OP. Upon release, the game was met with positive feedback from critics, but not nearly to the same extent as the original. Notice a lot of 8s and 7s compared to the original game's 9s across the board. Regardless, those review scores meant that the game had to be good, all things considered, given that a review score is the only way to determine a game's quality, and people sure did take it upon themselves to buy the game when the opportunity arose. With how rare copies of the original Xenoblade were, I couldn't blame them. As a result, this game went on to become not only the highest selling Xeno game, but Monolith's soft game. That is huge for the company and made this game quite the talking point. Even all these years later, its impact can still be felt, for better or worse. Reviewers may have generally favored this game, but let me tell you, there are rarely games that reach the same level of mixed reception as this one, at least as far as I can tell, because there have been heated debates aplenty. I've met people that love this game. I've met people that hate this game. I've met people that say this game surpasses the original in every way. I've met people that say this game fails in every area the original excelled in. There were so many thoughts going around on this game that could have influenced my personal stance before even playing it. This kind of feedback among my peers was and still is something else. But despite this, all I could think of before playing the game was that I had to experience it for myself. I mean, this is a sequel to one of my favorite games ever made, let alone a Nintendo Switch game. It had been just a little bit longer before I got a Switch, but with the World Ends With You Final Remix's announcement pushing me off the edge, I made it my mission to get the console. An HD remake of my second favorite game, as well as a sequel to my, at the time, third favorite game all in one console? I couldn't wait any longer. As a matter of fact, and some of you might not believe this, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was the first game I bought alongside my Switch purchase. But you know what's funny? I had never finished the game until making this video. What happened? Well, quite a lot. Apologies for the extra long intro, but this review has been a long time coming, both for the channel and myself. I immediately started playing it when I got home after the purchase, but ended up stopping after getting a couple of other games that I admittedly was having a lot more fun with than Xenoblade 2. Something about it just wasn't clicking with me, but I was sure I'd get back to it eventually. A few more Switch games later, putting it on the back burner even more, I finally decided that this was it. I am going to put some time aside to play this thing, and I did get to the end of Chapter 2, and that's as far as I ever got. The World Ends With You had released, Vesperia followed shortly behind, and life got a little crazy, but even when everything started to settle down, I ended up not wanting to play the game. That's because Xenoblade Chronicles 2 had managed to work its way onto my very small list of games I don't want to talk about at all. Games that I have a lot of opinions on one way or another, but just don't feel like putting those thoughts out there for fear of having to defend them against incredibly passionate fans and haters alike. Just in the few hours I had played of the game, I had a million different things to say about it all, both good and bad, but given just how intensely people were attacking and defending the game, I didn't have nearly the amount of energy I needed to contribute. What if I didn't like it? I was already not enjoying myself that much. It's a bit complicated and difficult to explain, but it's the same kind of feeling I get from games like Kingdom Hearts 3. I just know that my opinions are gonna get slaughtered the moment I let them out. So, screw it! I don't want to talk about Xenoblade Chronicles 2, hence the whole Xenoblade Chronicles 2 doesn't exist joke. A joke that I wish people didn't get mad at me for because I was simply using it as a tool to generate hype for when I'd inevitably talk about the game. Yeah, you heard me. I knew at some point or another I was gonna give this game the time of day, say. After all, not only was this literally one of the main reasons I bought the Switch in the first place, let alone my first game for the console, but it's a damn sequel to Xenoblade freaking Chronicles. You really think I was just not gonna play that? Hell no. It was just a matter of when, and after the announcement of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, I knew this game's time was just around the corner. If I'm gonna cover Xenoblade Chronicles on the channel, then I have to cover Xenoblade Chronicles 2, too. And it's funny because over time, I actually started to get excited about the upcoming journey. One way or another, this game got people to care on a level I don't think even the original can compare to. And if anything, I have to know why that is. With Definitive Edition reminding me why I fell for the original in the first place, my hopes for this game expanding on everything the original set out to do started to rise once more. It took me a while to get there, but I was finally excited to play Xenoblade 2 again. And I wasn't just gonna play it like some freaking casual. What do you think this is? I beat the game, did a good chunk of the side content, got a really nice grip on the combat, and bought the expansion pass, meaning I got to experience even more content on top of what was already included, and of course, Torna the Golden Country. Although I won't be talking about that too much since the entirety of it is a spoiler, this video's focus will be on the main game, but know that I did finish it, nearly to completion. And with that, all our bases are covered and there's nowhere left for me to go. Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, it's finally time for the revolutionary review of Xenoblade Chronicles X! I'm kidding. I just had to do it one more time. It's the revolutionary review for Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So, come on, let's show them a thing or three. The original Xenoblade was held back to a ridiculous extent in terms of its graphics. It was a Wii game after all. This made it all the more exciting that it was getting re-released onto an HD console for accessibility and a visual upgrade. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, however, was released onto an HD console from the get-go, meaning it had a lot more behind its graphical potential, and let me tell you, they pushed this system to the absolute limit. It runs at 720p and 30 frames per second, which is good. The frame rate did tend to dip whenever things would get too visually involved, and given the nature of this game's combat system, that happened a lot, but I got over it. I am a sucker for a higher frame rate, specifically 60 FPS, but this game was definitely designed with the 30 frames in mind, so it's not a deal breaker in the slightest. I just like to bring it up because I'm petty. However, there were a lot of moments where I'd quick travel to an area, only for the game to still be loading in many textures and assets right in front of me. I was gonna ignore this, but it became a consistent issue over time, and I could only give so many things a free pass. Let's go back to the positives though, because we still got a lot of them. I adore this game's color palette, using plenty of vibrant colors to make the world pop that much more. The scaling is even better than the first game too, and that's probably due to the much larger scope of the world. The level design and lay of the world itself both allow for larger environments to explore, and I love that. Xenoblade games are very rewarding to explore, if not for their in-game rewards, then just for the general scenery and wondrous feeling you get just by losing yourself in it all. I don't think that the areas are as visually stimulating from a conceptual standpoint as the original though. That game was packed with iconic scenery left and right, but I didn't find as many instances where I felt this way while playing Xenoblade 2. Now, don't get me wrong, the game does have its fair share of areas that made my jaw drop as a result of its conceptual design. I love the Tantal fields at night, this whatever raining from the sky in Uraya made for some gorgeous scenery. Leftherian Archipelago's giant islands on top of a sea of clouds was mesmerizing, and on that note, just the fact that all these locations take place along a giant cloud sea was a neat visually appealing idea for the world setting. Oh, and of course, the sun setting made every area look better, obvious point is obvious, but I don't know, I think the first game still has this one beat out when it comes to this particular category, which was a feeling I couldn't shake. Talking about the characters though, things get a bit complicated. Character designs are all over the place in terms of quality, at least in this guy's eyes. This is due to the large amount of different character designers, as this game has an enormous cast, the vast majority of which being Blades, which we'll get more into once we discuss the story and gameplay elements. As such, there are a lot of characters I like to look at, a lot I don't, and somewhat of a clash overall. I like the main characters' looks for sure, especially Pyra and M, these two look excellent. The big group of antagonists all look pretty cool too, but when put alongside the main party, it's very easy to tell that they were designed by different people. It's most noticeable when looking at the different illustrations because the engine does help alleviate the issue a good amount. However, it's still something that can be noted at all, hence why I'm bringing it up in the first place. Then with Blades, some clearly look better than others and again, clash with the main party. But if anything, it does add variety. Truth be told, while I'm listing this as a problem with the game's presentation, it didn't bother me as much as other people. Funnily enough, what did bother me was the lip syncing, or lack thereof, specifically in motion captured cutscenes. Now, the lip syncing admittedly wasn't to the level I was hoping for in the original Xenoblade, but there it was a lot more subtle and timed better with the English dub, so there weren't many instances where the characters weren't talking while the lips were still flapping. Here, because of how the characters' animations are a lot more exaggerated, this stuff happens more so than usual, and early on in the game took me out of a couple of scenes.
I remember now. That bastard stabbed me. Oh man, this is bad. Everyone in the guild is in danger.
This is a nitpick if anything, but I remember this bothering me more than the clash of character designs. So if a bunch of people are gonna complain about that, I have the right to complain about this. But that being said, I found scenes to be very competently animated in nearly every other aspect. Like the first game, there are normal cutscenes featuring the characters mostly standing around or doing somewhat stilted animations, but the motion captured scenes are so much better this time around, and they were already fantastic in the original. Look no further than the battle of Rex and Pyra versus Malos at the end of chapter 1. The way this fight is choreographed, the cinematography, how everyone moves so fluidly, it's incredible, and just gets better the further you are in the game. A lot of later battles feel like I'm watching an action movie rather than playing a game, which is a testament to how well done they truly are. The quality of the game's animation bleeds out into the main game as well, what with its attacks, effects, and whatnot. When the frame rate isn't crapping the bed, it all looks so good. But does it sound good? This game's voice acting is a very hot topic, especially when you take into consideration how god tier the original game's dub was. I, of course, played this game in English because, believe it or not, I like to play this game in my native language. Preposterous, I know, but I hope you all forgive me. I heard a lot of complaints about it, and while I don't think it's nearly as bad as I've heard people say it is, I can easily see why such hyperbolic statements would even be conceived. The original Xenoblade had one of the best dubs of all time. That's a very bold statement, I know, but I mean it. And given that this is a sequel, I'm sure people were paying much closer attention to it this time around. But overall, I'd say that the voice acting was great. The voice directing, on the other hand, was pretty bad. More often than characters simply sounding bad, they'd fall flat on their delivery, going 0 to 100 in some instances and not quite matching the tone of scenes in others. Which leads us to our main character, Rex. I don't hate Rex's voice, I don't even dislike it, but I do think that when it comes to the emotional screams, which, let's be honest, happens a lot in a Xenoblade game since the writers love to tear our hearts apart, he does not deliver in the slightest. I know people are sick and tired of hearing this scream near the beginning of the game, but I'm gonna play it anyway. Listen, I wasn't gonna do it, but this same scream plays in the same scene 3 times. Did nobody think it was, bad? And it doesn't get much better from there. Later on in the game, there's a really powerful, heartbreaking moment, and Rex screams in frustration, but it's so bad. It nearly took me out of the scene because the voice work doesn't deliver. And I know I need to stop comparing stuff like this to the original, but come on, dude. Compare this, which, mind you, happened a decent way into the game, to Shulk's chilling delivery. I'll kill you! That of which happened in the first few hours of his game. I don't know what happened when it came to the voice directing, but it didn't turn out great, I'll say that. Although credit where credit is due, Rex otherwise sounded good, hence why I do like his voice work overall. And occasionally, he has breakdowns in ways that are more somber than the previous protagonist. And in that sense, Al Weaver, voice of Rex, nails it. I spent a lot of time on Rex's voice, but I wanted to give both the positive and negative aspects of it proper attention. So you can understand me when I say that despite it all, I think Weaver did a good job. The rest of the cast is pretty solid too, mainly suffering, again, from the poor voice direction or lack thereof. My favorite of the bunch was Sky Bennett, who absolutely chewed the scenery with her insane range and voice control. She killed it, and is the shining star in a solid voice cast. That just leaves the soundtrack. The first game's OST was tied with The World Ends With You for my all-time favorite. Now, the side note, I do think I prefer The World Ends With You soundtrack just a smidge more after sitting on this for a while, so yeah. Now, how does this game compare? Let's put it like this. Whatever word you use to describe something of the utmost caliber, I promise you, it's not enough. I thought the soundtrack was on the same level as the original for a while, but that all changed when I reached more Ardain and heard this. And let me tell you, the quality never dipped from that point on, giving me banger after banger, all the while immersing me further into this massive world. I'm not gonna try to even think otherwise. This is a better complete soundtrack than the original Xenoblade. There are some tracks from the original, a lot of which with a similar feel that I prefer over tracks here, but overall, nah, this is the one. And boy oh boy, now I get to internally debate whether The One Ends With You or this soundtrack is better. Hooray! But yeah, dude, this soundtrack is so damn good. The scope feels much grander than before without sacrificing memorability. Each area is allowed to stand out from a musical standpoint alone because the variety is simply that high, with the quality delivering as well. This is one of the few soundtracks that feature music so good it gets me emotional. And it's freaking enormous, having over 100 tracks and featuring about 7 hours of dope-ass music. I can't imagine what the budget was for this alone. I'm struggling to find the words to convey my feelings towards it other than irrational praise, but like, jeez. And you're telling me we get even more in the Torna expansion? What the actual hell? Whew, that was quite a journey in of itself, wouldn't you say? Despite me thinking that the system would hold the game back graphically speaking, Xenoblade 2 comes out on top by a long shot due to its brilliant environmental design and scaling. Characters have as many great designs as they have poor ones, all clashing to the different art styles, but thankfully this isn't to the point where it distracts me enough. The game animates very smoothly at its peak in motion capture cutscenes, those of which featuring voice acting that's for the most part pretty good. And the soundtrack is just perfect, I've got no qualms there. I honestly don't remember liking the presentational aspects of the game that much when I first played it, but I'm pleasantly surprised. As I tend to emphasize in pretty much all of my recent reviews, this is the category with the least amount of importance, but these things are nice when done right, and if anything, I have a lot of fun talking about how the games look and sound. They play a great hand in immersing the player, and that immersive experience is one of the things I love most about video gaming as a whole. Thankfully, this game does a great job on this front, and since I have nothing else to talk about when it comes to all of this, it's time to get into the stuff I'm sure most of you are more interested in. My thoughts on the story, battle system, and overall gameplay. So let's take it from the top, shall we? Our story takes place in the world of Alrest. The original game setting was on 2 giant titans that made up the only land in a world full of endless sea. This game takes that concept to much greater heights by featuring a plethora of giant titans in a world full of endless clouds, with a giant world tree at the center. Our protagonist this time around is named Rex, as we've already stated in the presentation section, who's a salvager that stays on the back of a smaller titan he refers to as Gramps. Salvaging basically amounts to diving into the cloud sea to retrieve ancient artifacts, treasures if you will, for that sweet, sweet Chuck E. Cheese. One day while doing his usual thing, he's offered a job for more money than he knows what to do with from this badass looking group consisting of Jin, Malice, and Nia. They need help from a group of salvagers to bring up an ancient ship, which is an opportunity he, of course, jumps at despite the disapproval from Gramps. Killjoy. After doing his thing with the other salvagers, the trio ask him to come investigate the ship with them, and they find this mysterious and very attractive girl sleeping at the heart of it with a sword. It seems like Rex agrees with the latter, but as soon as he reaches out and touches the sword, he's immediately stabbed in the back and killed by Jin. So yeah, that was Xenoblade Chronicles 2, much shorter than the first game, but I guess that's fine. Okay, but seriously, he wakes up in this grassy field with the girl standing there by a tree. She introduces herself as Pyra, a legendary blade known as the Aegis. Blades are a species in this world that come from core crystals and grant their driver, the person who awakens said blade from their core crystal, a weapon to use. They're completely sentient, but not always humanoid, and when a blade driver dies, they return to their core crystal for a new driver to awaken them. Since Pyra's the Aegis, however, she's an exception to this rule and has been sealed away here for a long time. She informs him that he's only a few hours in and already dead in what's supposed to be a 60-hour journey, but has the power to bring him back should she share some of her core crystal's life force with him. That is, under one condition. He has to take her to Elysium, the place they're at right now. Only, you know, in real life, since this is just the visualization of Pyra's memory. Rex agrees to this not only because he wants to live, but the sad reality of Alrest is that titans are slowly but surely falling into the Cloud Sea after a considerable amount of time, meaning less and less land for the people to live on. Not to mention, as titans begin to run low on their lifespan, the lands start to lose vegetation and vital resources, which has been leading to some tension between various people that could potentially lead to war. If Rex manages to take Pyra to Elysium, which lies in the world tree according to her, then there'd be no need for fighting over livable land, and the fear of the world just falling wouldn't be a thing anymore. They agree and manage to fight their way off the ship with some help from Nia, who warmed up to Rex after chatting with him a bit, and Gramps, who flies in to save the day. With this, their goal is set. reach Elysium. Of course, things get a bit more complicated along the way with the group they were betrayed by at the beginning having goals of their own, and some other players entering the game on top of the whole Titans falling situation. There's quite a bit going on, but a clear mission to drive it all forward for, like I said earlier, the enormous adventure you're about to embark on. You know what? Let's start off with that. This is around a 60-hour game, much like the original, but even so, there's more story to this game than before. How does that work? Well, I think it's pretty clear that calling this game 60 hours doesn't necessarily mean all 60 of those hours are spent storytelling. So in this game's case, more time is spent doing just that. I mean, it's telling how in the first game the final boss is around level 80, and in this one they're about level 70. You'll be spending a lot more time than you'd expect watching cutscenes play out, because this game has a much heavier focus on the story, even more so than the first game, and I find that this works in the narrative's favor. I'm a firm believer that games can in fact be too long as a result of poor pacing, but if done right, games with a considerable runtime can prove to be some of the most engaging stories out there. See Fire Emblem Three Houses or Persona 5. And note that this goes double for character-driven stories. Now, Xenoblade 2 takes a while to really get going, I'll say that much. I did mention at the beginning of the video how I had a really hard time getting into it when I first started to play it a couple of years back, and even through my playthrough specifically for this video, I felt that a lot of time wasn't used as efficiently as it could have been. For example, there's a part where a party member has gotten kidnapped, so you gather information on where they are. You find out where they are, then have to break into their facility. Only to break into their facility, you need to give your party member a blade of their own. Only to give them a blade of their own, you have to gather all these materials in order to do so. I wonder why they felt the need to pad out what's ultimately a straightforward portion of the game to such an extent. And truth be told, there are a couple more moments like this, but like many people say, once you get past chapter 3, the game really picks up, not just by cutting down on portions like these, but bringing out the harder hitting plot points. Although with this in mind, I'm gonna go ahead and say that the story's pacing was one of, if not the biggest issue I had with it overall. The beginning of the game isn't even the only time that pacing felt like an issue, but that problem persisted throughout a good chunk of the campaign. This is a long story, but even still, I felt like it could have benefited from a couple more hours. You're given huge revelations in the last couple chapters of the game, including a ton of information on the game's antagonists in order to personify them that much further and attempt to justify why they do what they do, which is great, but they're simply presented in flashbacks shown to the player, meaning there was really no reason to wait as long as they did. Because of this, it almost feels like too many answers are given to the player in a short amount of time with little to no breathing room. And while I enjoyed finally getting to know the answers to all my questions, it was very possible for them to be spread out a bit better. Some of these twists and revelations, particularly the cutscene at the beginning of the final chapter, sure, keep it at the end. But most of the other scenes could have been spread out a bit better. Not to mention, you get your full party really late in the game, which sure can be said for the original, but there it felt like a Chrono Trigger type deal, giving you what was essentially a full party for the majority of the game with a surprise 7th character joining you a fair ways in. So I didn't mind it there. But this time around, it clearly felt as if I was missing a party member slot for over half of the game, and was wondering when I'd get that final slot filled. When it did happen, I was excited because I wanted to make sure that the game had enough of an opportunity to characterize them to the extent I yearned for. But because of how late in the game they join you, that extent was never truly reached. On their own, I was already in love with their character, don't get me wrong. But my main issue stemmed from a lack of banter with the rest of the cast. And on that note, that's another issue I have, a lack of party banter within the main story. There are moments where the characters are allowed to just talk with one another, but I don't know if I'd say there were enough of these, with barely any, if any at all, occurring after the final member joined the party, since the story was nearing its conclusion at that point. There is somewhat of a workaround to this issue, which we'll put a pin in for now, but the point still stands. Next, I'd like to talk about the whole topic of this game being, as some may say, too anime. I've heard this phrase a lot when listening to Xenoblade 2 discussions, and while I don't think that's the best way of putting it, I see what they mean when players refer to the story as such. The Xenoblade series, and Xeno franchise as a whole if we're being honest, has always had some sort of anime influence, not only in terms of its art direction, but its story as well. So I can understand people's frustration when others simply refer to this one when pointing it out. But I think we can all at least agree that this game is more in tune with said influence over the others, not only with the way the characters express themselves, but certain story tropes and even a few of its themes. That being said, this isn't entirely a bad thing. The big anime influence tropes never bothered me. I fail to see why this is always perceived in such a negative light when most of us playing this are anime fans anyway. If anything, they added a lot of charm to the game and allowed for the characters to be a bit more expressive than before, which is nice since this is clearly a character-driven story. Just through the plot synopsis alone, that's pretty easy to tell. The original Xenoblade focused more on how the development of the narrative affected the cast, making it a plot-driven journey. The Mechon are causing havoc on Bionis, so Shulk, Rhine, and Fiora. Sorry, it's not funny. They all go to show them what's up. How that mission evolves after various revelations on the world and the mecha and themselves reflect onto the changes seen in our cast of characters. This game's main plot focuses on how the development of the cast affects the narrative. Rex wants to get to Elysium to reach his dream of a new world for everyone to share and help Pyra, who saved his life. How the characters grow over the course of the game, along with interacting with different types of people, evolve that goal as you progress. And if you know me, you know I love these types of tales. Much like the narrative itself though, it took me a bit to get as invested as I wanted to, but when it reaches that point, man oh man. A lot of people said that the game's story takes a humongous leap in quality after chapter 3, which I'd be inclined to agree with, but I wouldn't say that means everything before that was bad. That's so far from the truth. I did complain about the pacing, but I'd say that I was still enjoying myself and appreciated how this time was spent to develop the cast. And if anything, events that take place later in the game only strengthened my appreciation for how these opening hours were, since they were used, again, as character development, along with world building and genius subtle foreshadowing. With all this in mind and all my negatives out of the way, I'm just gonna come out and say it. I loved this story, front to back, and in a manner that even its flaws I pointed out ironically only raised my love for it that much further. For as much praise as I give the original game story, this is at least on the same level and for entirely different reasons. So allow me to use the rest of this story segment to gush about how it does just that. Where that game excelled at its gigantic scope, subversive narrative, and thematic brilliance, this one delivers a much more personal and intimate story while providing that thematic brilliance once again in its own unique manner. Like I said, the beginning may be a bit slower than you'd expect, or perhaps would even want, but when things get moving, it refuses to slow down. There are a lot of events that happen back to back, and pretty much all of which have relevance to the bigger picture. From chapter 4 onward, I didn't feel like any major moments wasted my time, and like I said earlier, I would have been fine if the game was even longer. A lot happens and a lot changes, which has made my job a lot harder in keeping the footage you're seeing spoiler free, but I applaud the game for having so much take place in it that I'm having this problem in the first place. I also love how these story changes have impacts on the gameplay, as the game will add, take away, and even change properties of your party members a lot. I feel like a lot of other games I've played have been afraid to do this, so something like this was very different but welcomed all the same. I love how this kept me on my toes the whole way through. The game's got a bit more cheese than the first, with elements like the power of friendship and whatnot being a bit less subtle than the OG, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it the focus when taking its themes into play. If anything, there's an emphasis on the more mature talking points, such as learning to love yourself and even the meaning of life. That's specifically getting interesting perspectives with the game's blades. Their whole existence can be simplified as being tools for humans, since they're born with that purpose in mind, and when their driver dies, they return to their course with their memory completely erased, waiting for their next driver to wake them up. I love how the game takes a deep dive into the moralities of this concept, and how that in of itself plays a major role with the antagonistic group's goals. Which, on that note, I love it when stories have an antagonist party to rival the main party you travel with. That's always been one of my favorite story tropes, and this is another example of it being done right. Each member isn't necessarily the opposite to a specific party member of yours, but that in turn allows them to stand out on their own right without directly needing to clash with their opposite character. Honestly, I love this game's group of antagonists a lot better than the first game's collection, and I say that with no disrespect, mind you. Both games excel in this area. The ones here just vibed with me a bit more. Since we're on the topic of characters, let's talk about Rex. I did like him from the start, but he took a bit to grow on me to the level I expect out of a Xenoblade protagonist, since Shulk and I clicked very quickly. That's not to say he never got there though, because believe you me, he did. Rex has a lot going on mentally, and I even saw a lot of myself in the poor guy. He's very snarky and sure of himself when it comes to salvaging, but when he becomes a driver for the Aegis no less and has turned into this larger than life conflict, oh boy. You can see him being intimidated by it all and unsure if he's really worthy of playing such a pivotal role in it all, which made for a lot of heartbreaking scenes and hell yeah moments later down the line. Thanks to the game's length and focus on story, he's given such a natural rate of progression to the point where I never saw him as being static or uninteresting. I thought I'd come out of the game liking him all things considered, but in actuality, I ended up loving the guy. And he's not even my favorite. That would be M, who unfortunately I can't talk about due to spoilers. She honestly became one of my favorite characters in all of Xenoblade, so it sucks that I can't go much further than that, but blah. The rest of the cast is pretty great too, with my favorites being my precious and needlessly fantastic child of a character Poppy, the beautifully written and beautifully presented Pyra, the motherforkin' Zekinator, along with Nia, and all you guys. Believe me when I say that everyone is a great character who I can easily see being someone else's favorite. I do feel they're a bit less interwoven than the first game's cast, unfortunately, because like I said, party interactions are kept at a minimum, but that's easily my biggest issue issue with them, and it's not even a deal breaker for one particular reason. It's time to unpin that point I alluded to earlier, because heart-to-hearts are here to save the day. Why am I talking about heart-to-hearts here and not in the gameplay section? Well, that's because affinity works a bit differently in this game, as they aren't really a thing between the main driver characters. This means that there's no affinity requirements for heart-to-hearts, and all you need to view them are having the required party members and blades needed to participate in the conversation. This is incredible, because if anything, they act like the Tales series skits, where yes, they're technically optional, but once you've got the party members required to view them, nothing's stopping you from watching them. So why wouldn't you? They act as extra incentive to explore the expansive world that much more and further characterize these phenomenal characters in ways the main story wouldn't allow. My only issue with these is that I kinda wanted more. I looked at every single one I was able to, given all the blades I ended the game with, but there are still plenty I missed out on. After all, I didn't unlock every single blade in the game despite the expansion pass giving me more opportunities to do so, and out of the ones I did get, I did still find certain party members to have minimal interaction when it was all said and done. I would add a bit more just between main party members, as while there were a lot, and even better is the fact that they're completely voiced, the cast could have benefited from more combinations of characters taking part in the discussion. Regardless of this, I clearly enjoyed them a lot if my complaint is that there were too few of them, and streamlining the requirements to view these was one of the best improvements this game made from the original Chronicle. All of these reasons elevate the story's quality to the level in which I described earlier. It's so damn good, and the way it all wraps up is freaking jaw-dropping. And don't worry, I'm not gonna spoil it, I can talk about this without giving it all away. In the first game, they kind of throw this big, mind-bending plot twist at you right towards the end, which was always weird to me. I failed to bring this up in the original review because it honestly happened so fast and out of nowhere that I forgot to mention it, but I never understood the inclusion. This game does a similar feat, but builds up to the big game changer across the last couple of chapters, making the twist hit that much harder and feel earned. Not to mention, the way the game rewards those who played the original, holy crap, it's so good, and empowers the twist to an even further status. And guys, that ending. The original Xenoblade has one of my favorite endings of all time for how satisfying, conclusive, and wholesome it is, with Future Connected making it even better. But after playing this game, I think, maybe, probably, I like this ending a little bit more. It's so crazy, dude, because the ending's a lot shorter than the first game, but that's because it doesn't need to say much. It shows you the fruits of your labor, the characters' actions speak for themselves, the music is incredible, and that last shot to go along with the final notes of the ending theme sent chills down my spine. Mother 3 was the game that got the most emotional response out of me throughout its wild ride of a narrative, but running right behind it is Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And keep in mind, it's been 5 years since I last played Mother 3. Putting the ending and how much of a mess I was after it aside, there were so many moments that got me invested for being empowering, heartbreaking, confusing, frustrating, etc, etc. There's a quote in this game that goes, "I love this world because you're in it," and my God, what a powerful line to go with an even more powerful character moment, and a testament to exactly the kind of story it is. It's such an emotional journey, and the fact that the writing is of such quality that it was able to invoke all these feelings in a guy so out of tune with his emotional side is phenomenal. Again, I can't really talk about Torna because the whole thing is a spoiler, but it's a really neat addition to the game as far as the story's concerned. We've talked a good long while about the story, but there's just so much to say about it, which in of itself earns it brownie points from your boy. It's long, it's emotional, it's character driven, and it's brilliant, all wrapping up together in one of the best ways I've seen this industry provide. But I think that was more than enough time spent on all that. What do you say we fight somebody? We've got a lot to go over in terms of the game's battle system, but let's start with the basics. If you played the original, there's some familiarity here despite the differing UI. You can play as anyone in the main party and initiate fights with enemies on the overworld. Some of them will attack you on sight or if you make noise around them, but unlike the first game, the icons that let you know whether enemies will do this or not are completely gone, which is an odd omission. This could easily be patched in, but the fact that it hasn't been done yet means it's probably not gonna happen, so I don't know what the deal is. Anyway, when standing still, your character will use their basic auto attacks, meaning no, you can't auto attack while moving anymore. But hey, your auto attacks can become a 3-hit combo if you don't use any arts or move, which is undeniably cool. As you can see, you can still equip arts, but you can't have as many on you at once, or at least it appears that way. Arts are done with the face buttons rather than going through a menu, which I do like quite a bit, and the directional pads are used to switch between different blades, those of which giving the driver their own weapon type along with their own set of arts. You can have up to 3 blades at a time, each having their own weapon type, meaning up to a total of 9 different arts per character if you so choose choose to mix it up. Every weapon type has 4 arts to choose from, with only 3 being equipable at once, allowing for customization in how you want to build your party, not only in terms of what weapon they all use, but what kind of arts from said weapon. Alrighty, we're adding so many layers to the game's combat. The main campaign doesn't have a talent art like before, but something else that fills its void: the specials. There are 4 levels of special attacks you can raise by using arts and raising affinity with your blade in combat. Your affinity between the driver and the blade is represented by the line of light between the 2 characters, with it being yellow at max affinity. It's raised by keeping the 2 characters close to each other and canceling auto attacks into arts. Using a special will result in you having to complete a button prompt for the highest damage output, and the animations that precede it are pretty badass. You'll want to use these in higher level specials back to back, as you'll not only increase the amount of damage done because of this, but also unlock different routes on special attack branches leading up to a cinematic finisher of an attack. This is called a blade combo. You'll notice that while you can still break and topple enemies with the same being able to happen to you, daze is no longer a part of the picture. This time you can break and topple opponents, but instead of dazing them afterwards, you can now launch the opponent out of a topple, leaving them suspended in air for a bit, and then follow that up by smashing them right back down for extra goodies and a considerable amount of damage. This is called a driver combo. What's even cooler is that if you manage to do one of each step from a blade or driver combo at the same time, you'll perform a fusion combo that stacks even more damage than usual. The timing, of course, gets a lot stricter when you're attempting to do this with launch and especially smash, but the game makes you feel so good if you manage to pull it off. And these possibilities, again, add so many more layers to combat than before. The party gauge plays a similar role as last time. There are 3 sections and you can use a full one to revive a party member. You need at least 1 if your controlled character dies, otherwise you'll be transported back to the last checkpoint. If you fill them all up and get to a certain moment in the story where this feature is unlocked, you'll be able to do a chain attack, which has also gotten a bit of an upgrade. Remember, driver affinity isn't a thing in this game. How then do you extend the rounds of chain attacks? Well, at the end of every blade combo branch, you'll give the enemy an orb for the respective element you used. These orbs not only make that element less effective at the end of a blade combo, but will stack on other orbs until you destroy them through a chain attack. Only blades will participate in these, as they all have one element tied to them. You'll want to choose which blade specifically to use, as they'll target a random element unless their opposite element is present. After hitting an orb a couple of times, the orb will burst and extend the chain attack to another round. You want to keep destroying orbs each round to keep the chain attack extended as long as possible, and raise that damage multiplier as much as you can. If you can fill up the elemental burst gauge, which replaces the party gauge during a chain attack, you'll dish out an attack that deals a colossal amount of damage. Play your cards right, and you can eventually get to the point where you'll be dishing out millions of damage points, which is a bit ridiculous but feels so good. Believe it or not, there's even more to this game's combat, such as drivers having skill trees to keep up with, leveling up arts to make them more powerful, blades having their own skill tree being handled like an achievement system, pouch items to give your character different buffs over battle, equipment for drivers in the main cast, upgrading weapons, secret battle techniques. If you thought the first game had an overwhelming amount of options to be used in combat, you'll be just as shocked as I was when more and more features become available to you over the course of the game. I will give Xenoblade 2 credit for that. It does take its time in introducing the mechanics to you in order to keep things from becoming way too much to process, but it's ironic that the insane amount of tutorials fail to explain said mechanics as much as they should. I found myself not understanding a good amount of the combat for a while, and I do think that the game could stand to be a bit clearer with its direction, but that's okay. Well, for me anyway. My favorite game of all time, Tales of Vesperia, suffers from a similar issue, meaning I had to learn a lot of its ins and outs on my own, and now that I have, it's gone on to be, well, my favorite game, let alone my favorite combat system out of any JRPG. This game has a lot going for it, most of which you'll have to figure out on your own, which did lead to many frustrations on my first attempt to play the game all those years back. And even in the beginning of this playthrough, the game felt so sluggish that I knew I was missing something. There's no way it's supposed to be like this. And I was partially correct, because when it finally clicks, oh my god. You know that feeling when you stop being such a loser and start drinking water? Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like. As I said earlier, you can cancel auto attacks into arts, meaning there's a bit of a combo system here. And remember, you have a regular 3-hit combo with auto attacks alone, meaning your arts can not only do more damage if you cancel into them, but when in that combo you do so also plays a hand in determining how much damage will be done. Do you quickly cancel into an art after that first attack, or do you wait at the tail end for the slightest bit more damage? You can eventually gain a skill that allows for you to cancel into arts from other arts, which makes the game even more fast-paced, and maybe could have been given to the player at some point in the main story. I think that skill in particular makes combat way too fun to be locked behind a missable skill. I didn't even know about it until the final dungeon. You better believe I made a beeline for it in the Torna expansion. You can also cancel both auto attacks and arts into switching another blade, which you can then cancel into another art into a special attack, meaning a lot of stringing together different arts, stacking the damage that much higher, and reaching a satisfactory level the original game never managed to reach. As much as I love that game's combat system with with its emphasis on team synergy and positioning, this game's combat not only has that focus to an extent, but also introduces different combo mechanics to add to it all. No matter how you slice it, there's a lot more depth this time around, all without falling into the same pitfalls as before. As a result of all this, battles are a lot more involved, as you can't rely on the same break topple days combo over and over again. You now have to use different elements, and even then you'll have to mix it up if you want to keep damage output as high as possible, all the while attempting the more investing combination of break, topple, launch, smash. Add in a high risk, high reward party gauge elevated that much further with the changes made to the chain attacks. There was a huge effort to make battles much more engaging, and I think it's safe to say that they succeeded. It took me a while to get accustomed to it all, but now that I know how just about everything works, I want to hop back into the game and challenge all the higher level monsters with my improved skill level. But I might still have to do some side quests and grind it out to stand too much of a chance. Like the first game, low-level runs and self-imposed challenge is possible, but I feel like that skill ceiling is a bit higher than usual, and only the very best of us players will get the most out of that kind of stuff. And on that note, we've got some gripes to get out of the way. Believe me, I had a ton of fun with combat. There are incredibly high points throughout the game. But the same can be said for the opposite end of the spectrum, featuring much lower lows than the first game's battle system. First, there's that whole sluggish complaint I had. Even when I did figure out the mechanics, that issue never entirely disappeared. A big part of the game's combat system is raising the affinity level between driver and blade, as that'll result in an increase of stats, but that also means you're back at square one in the beginning of each and every battle. To go back to my Vesperia comparison, the game starts off pretty slow all things considered, but as your skill grows over the course of the game, so too does your playable characters. Eventually, everyone will have much higher base stats, and in turn, a higher amount of agility, making later fights much faster paced. Here, it's like that steady progression happens in every battle, meaning you always start off with this painfully slow movement speed and have to build it up each and every time. In a combat system where you want to move over and grab HP potions that can drop from different attacks, pick up items if you so happen to smash an opponent, or catch up with said opponent if they decide to be a pain in the ass and move around a bunch, it can get really frustrating when your movement speed isn't up to snuff. This goes double for when enemies start getting the incredibly annoying status ailment of Shackle, which considerably drops the affinity level between driver and blade. All that hard work, gone, and it is the worst. Hell, all status ailments are the worst, because for some reason, your party members can't come over and snap you out of them anymore. Even in Future Connected when Affinity was gone, party members were still able to do this, heightening that team synergy element to the game, but that's just not possible here. And since there's no item usage in this game much like before, when you're toppled, you've just gotta deal with it. When you're launched, you've just gotta deal with it. When you're shackled, you've just gotta deal with it. You get the picture. It feels like a means to waste my time more than anything, leading to a ton of frustration. Speaking of wasting time, when I didn't really understand combat around the beginning, I found battles to take way too long. I'm at the right level and I'm not necessarily bad at the game, I just don't know how to properly blade and driver combo, but the game punished this way too early, way too harshly. If you know what you're doing, you can do an insane amount of damage, so to compensate for this, enemies are given a crap ton of HP, a little too much, at least early on. In combination with how little experience you get from normal enemy encounters, I felt no need to engage in combat since I was getting by fine enough. This in turn led me to not getting too big a grip on the combat as early as I could have. Raising the experience gained from normal encounters just a smidge more would have incentivized me to fight more often. Bosses were how I really started to learn how things worked, but unfortunately, they're really hit or miss this time around. There are a couple of standouts, but I want to say that there are even more low points out of the bunch than the original, one of which being the final boss, which was a decent fight, but not nearly as good as I was hoping it'd be. But where that fight was just kinda disappointing, there are a couple of fights that drove me insane. I'm sure we all know at least one of the ones I'm referring to, and believe you me, I will never hear the word rogue the same ever again. And I was just getting into roguelikes too. Not to mention, a lot of them have FU attacks that one-shot me, or in some cases, the entire party. And thanks to this not being an action RPG where you can dodge any and all attacks with ample reaction time and enough skill, whether you dodge them or not is completely left up to RNG, meaning a lot of frustrating cheap deaths. The funniest part is, most of the bosses that have these attacks don't even use them all the time. I remember one boss party wiped me, but the very next attempt they didn't use the attack at all. Makes you wonder why they're even there other than to get a cheap KO, but whatever, I guess. It says a lot that most of these issues can be avoided or at least reduced to a great extent if you so choose to master the game's combat system. But I'll be lying if I said the journey to get there wasn't as frustrating as it was enlightening. Let's bring up that Vesperia comparison one more time, because while learning that game's combat, I never felt annoyed or frustrated, at least to the level of this game. I just felt like I was missing something and kept experimenting with different things until it all finally clicked. Here, I knew I was missing something, but the game was giving me a lot of crap for not getting that's something. And can you really blame me? The tutorials are not only way too much, but suck at even doing their job. Not to mention nearly everything is so different. Equipment amounts to just 2 slots. I have to update my weapons at nearly every town. My main weapon is hot? What the hell is all of this? But that being said, the feeling you get when you understand it all is so invigorating and almost makes you forget about all the frustration it took to get there. I can see why people would get annoyed out of playing the game, but I implore you to stick with it. There's a lot to it, some of which I don't want to go over because that's extra knowledge you can get by just playing the game, but it's good. It's so damn good. That being said, I don't know if I'd say it's necessarily better than the first games. While there are higher jumps in quality, there are equally as low drops to the point where they kinda equalize each other onto the same plane. They both excel in many different areas. The first game for the depth that lies in its simplicity, the larger emphasis on team synergy, and the fact that it's much more consistent. The second for its many added mechanics, potential to be much faster paced, and its ambition. But regardless of that fact, and if it wasn't obvious enough, the game's combat is fantastic. And hey, you've even got the Torna expansion that, for my money at least, is the best out of the bunch. Oh, and the final boss is even better than the one in the main campaign. I will die on that hill. Anyway, we've just got some cleanup to do in terms of the gameplay, so let's get through this home stretch and finish strong. Let's start with the towns, overworld, and dungeons. Every town is the perfect size yet again. Some are really big, some are really small, but they all fit perfectly with the setting and kind of place they presented themselves to be. NPCs all run around and do their own thing depending on the endgame clock as before, which again helps to immerse me in the game that much more. The overworld is just as big as you'd expect from the first game, and given that we're on more powerful hardware, they squeezed a lot out of the game without needing a load screen to separate the different sections. Nearly every Titan features a town, dungeon, and gigantic overworld between the different areas. And so long as you stay on that one Titan, you never have to deal with a loading screen. That's damn impressive to say the least. But even more impressive is the game's, shall we say, level design. There's a lot more verticality and pathways weaving in and out of each other, meaning the mindset of having multiple ways to reach the same destination is taken to the extreme. Honestly, I'd say this makes traveling through the world even more fun than it already was in the original game. Everything feels denser and as if a lot more thought was put into it all. With this in mind, there are even a couple of dungeons that stand out for their set pieces and creative design liberties taken. The game even rewards you for going out of your way to explore by adding treasure chests with goodies inside them, and I think that's really awesome. In fact, there was only one dungeon I flat out disliked, and for those who played the game, you know exactly which one I'm talking about. Remember the boss I alluded to earlier? Ironically, the dungeon I'm alluding to now ended with that boss. Can you figure out what the low point of the game was for me? That glaring exception aside, level design is fantastic. So, it's too bad that the map and compass nearly killed a good portion of them. This compass is garbage, as it'll tell you how close you are to an area, but not exactly which layer it's on, or how to get to where it's pointing. There were so many instances, especially later down the line, where you have to go in the opposite direction of where the compass is pointing in order to get to your destination. But you wouldn't think to do that since, hello, it's pointing in the opposite direction. A part of me wishes that you could just turn this thing off. Hell, I've started to turn off mini-maps in my JRPGs in order to clean up the HUD and allow for myself to explore the world at my leisure, but I could never turn off that compass, leading to a lot of frustrating moments over the course of the story. I wish they would just patch in an improvement Xenoblade Definitive Edition made, where you'll have a dotted pathway that tells you exactly where to go. In that game, I toggled it off, but it made for a nice safety cushion in case I ever got too lost or was looking for an item in a side quest. This game would have greatly benefited from something like that. Another issue I had with exploration were the field skill checks that started appearing in the main story the further you got. Blades have some skills that can be used in the overworld, and for the majority of the game, they're completely optional. So I felt no need to focus on them. But then you're hit with a roadblock and no way to get around it, and you have to grind that skill out in order to progress. These were some of the more frustrating elements of the game, as what should be a simple action turns into a 30-minute minimum grind fest. There should have been some other set piece, or heck, another way to get around these. And why the hell do I have to watch this stupid animation every freaking time I do a field action? I've done this a million times, just do the flippin' thing! On the topic of side quests, I feel they're about on the same plane as the original, or I guess Definitive Edition now. Most of them amount to defeating or collecting X amount of Y like before, but a decent amount were varied enough. My patience on minimal effort side quests admittedly has worn a lot thinner since cross-coding its excellent side quests, but they're different games, I understand. It's just, Whatever. Torna handles side quests a bit differently, having a whole community system to keep track of, and because of how well organized it all was, that incentivized me to do them all. Plus, I was having a lot of fun and didn't mind anyway. Oh, and a lot of the side quests in the main campaign anyway were voiced over, which was cool. A big reason for this was because a good chunk of the side quests center around the different blades you collect over the game. Not so much the common blades, but the rare ones. Yes, there are different tiers of blades you can get over the course of the game. Common blades all kind of look the same, with rare blades having more intricate designs. These in particular are where the different character designers really came into play. That just begs the question though, how do you get blades? There are rewards for different side quests, right? Well, some of them, yes, but the majority are unlocked through gacha. And nope, I'm not kidding. Eventually, you'll start earning core crystals, and you use these to summon a new blade. There's a low chance you'll get the rare ones, of course, with that summon rate being higher if you use a rare core crystal, or the even scarcer legendary core crystal. If you bought the expansion pass, you're given a lot of these to use, which I appreciated. I mean, the expansion pass is cheaper than buying Torna by itself, even though it includes the entirety of Torna. I don't really get that at all, but hey, I saved money and got even more stuff. But I've gotta say, I used a lot of core summoning blades over the course of the game, and still have a ton I'm missing out on. Truth be told, I wasn't big on this at first. Why can't I just unlock everything by completing side quests? I would constantly think to myself, especially when I use one of my very limited amount of legendary core crystals, only to be met by another common. I can only count on one hand the amount of legendary core crystals I got besides the ones the game gave me from the expansion pass. But in all fairness, there are ample opportunities to raise the summon rate of rare blades even more if you decide to get rid of your common blades. Because of this, and with how customizable and full of depth each rare blade is on their own, it didn't really matter that I didn't have much because I didn't need much. I was very satisfied with the blades I was given to work with, and if anything, this adds replay value. The next time I play this, I can get even more added to my collection and customize my drivers totally different as a result. Not to mention, kudos to the developers for resisting the urge to add microtransactions here. This could have easily been a very scummy stain on a very solid game, but it's not. So if you couldn't tell, I grew to really like this manner of gaining additional blades. I hate to admit how much I like gacha games, as the feeling of getting that super rare waifu character is a great one. Plus, like I said, this adds a lot of replay value to a very beefy game. No two playthroughs have to be the same, and that's always a quality in a game I appreciate. I'm a fan of this for being creative and a lot of fun. Oh, with that, I think I'm done. There are many other gameplay elements that I'm missing out, both intentionally and probably unintentionally, but we'd be here all day. These are the elements of the game I wanted to highlight, and I think I got my point across. Hopefully. I finally finished Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and its Torna expansion. Now that it's all said and done, what did I think about it? God, what a ride, both in terms of this video and the game itself. I've had a lot to say about this game on many aspects, but the common factor is a boatload of ambition. There was clearly an effort to top the legendary Xenoblade Chronicles in everything it tried to do, or attempt the same thing in a different manner, with the hope of being better. The world could be bigger with the story reaching that scale, but on the foundation of a much more intimate quest, and the length in which such a story needed to be contained could pave the way for character progression like never before. Environments could be bigger, but a lot more intricately designed this time around. And of course, combat could only improve from this point onward, right? I imagine this was the mindset anyway, resulting in the beast of a game we were given. But of course, development never goes perfectly, and the Switch has much more limitations when compared to the rest of the consoles from the same gen. As a result, and due to some intentional design choices, not all of it's perfect, and while I had a lot of good to say over the course of the review, I had a lot of negatives to provide as well. Truth be told, the further I got into this game, the more scared I grew to even consider reviewing it. All of this build up to a game I'm sure people would assume I'm gonna bash on was already pressure enough, but the more I played the game, I started to get similar vibes to how I felt when playing Tales of Grace's F. For as many aspects I loved about the game, there were equally as many I hated, and I didn't know how people would perceive me feeling this way about the game. Admittedly, fear for how others will react to my opinions is a personal problem I'm still trying to get over, but I digress. Much to my surprise, however, something magical happened. The more I played the game, the less those issues I had with it bothered me. I was understanding the combat, I was enjoying the environments to the same level of the first game, if not more. I had finally began to love these characters and understood why they acted the way they did in the beginning. All the pieces started to line up, and when I was hit by that ending, I was in awe. When trying to gather my thoughts together as I stared at that final title screen, all I could think of was this one line. This one phrase that I never thought I'd come to, that I never wanted to admit for whatever reason, and a phrase that I say a lot, but rarely mean to the extent I do here. That phrase being, I love this game. I love this game. I love the cheesy speeches Rex gives over the course of the game. I love how it unapologetically dives into its anime influence more than its Xenoblade brethren. I love how every chapter gives the game a different title screen, with the final one being the perfect send-off to the 60-hour beast you just conquered. I love how there's so much to do, it's freaking overwhelming. I love that the game pushes this console so far that it feels like it's gonna burst with all the graphical issues and slowdown. Believe it or not, I adore this game just as much as the original, and if anything, it at least has the potential to overcome it somewhere down the road. But I definitely need to sit on that for like a couple of years before I ever come to a conclusion. While it doesn't top the original in every sense, it does in a good amount, and comes really damn close in the areas that it doesn't, all the while providing an overall experience so complete and satisfying that I couldn't care less. Would you believe me if I told you that after finishing the game, I kinda wanted to do it all over again? Only this time I could get even more blades to add to my collection, complete even more of the side quests, build my characters that much higher. When I first started to play the game, I figured I was just gonna like it. About halfway through, I was expecting to love and hate it. Now that it's all said and done and I've had time to let it sit in, my final verdict is this. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, regardless if it's better or worse than the original, is on the same plane and proves to be a worthy follow-up to its legacy. It's polished, packed to the brim, and never knew when to stop trying to outdo itself, as it shines bright with pure, unapologetic ambition. In the end, the very first Switch game I ever bought, the game I put on the back burner for years, and the tail end of many harmless jokes on my channel, ended up being an incredible work of art, patiently waiting to be appreciated. And my god, was it ever worth the wait.